History is full of crossroads. Some we took, some we missed. Welcome to the Alternate Chronicle, where we don't just tell you what happened, we imagine what could have been.
In 1346 BC, Egyptian Pharaoh Akhenaten tried to pull off the greatest propaganda victory in history. He attempted to airdrop an entirely new religion onto his unwilling subjects. We'll answer these questions and more on this alternate history. The Egyptian people had been slowly shifting away from polytheism for decades before Akhenaten took the throne. A growing number of Egyptians had begun worshipping a single supreme god, Aten, who embodied the sun disk. Even Akhenaten's own family wasn't fully committed. His wife, Nefertiti, still prayed to the old gods in private. What if his successors, maybe had crushed the old priesthood and redoubled down on worship of the Aten? Well, first, Egypt would have been thoroughly and permanently changed. The pharaoh would have become even more powerful. As the single religious leader of the nation, he would have supplanted the old priesthood and claimed their wealth and land for himself. To them, the once polytheistic Egyptians now worshipped a single god. It's likely that several local cults would emerge in opposition to Aten, or that Aten would absorb local deities into its pantheon. And the effects of Akhenaten's reign of terror would be felt for thousands of years. In this alternate timeline, the Greek encounter a monotheistic Egypt. What if the Egyptians' experiment with one god had taken root and spread throughout the ancient world? Now I have a question for you. What do you think the world would be like if Aten had replaced Yahweh as the one true God? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching. Remember to subscribe to be notified every time we release a new video. And remember, stay thirsty, my friends. Well, that question is left for another video. But one thing is certain, the world would look vastly different if the sun god had won. Sun worship symbols and rituals may have survived the march of history and influenced modern spiritual traditions. And in the minds of millions, the Egyptian pharaohs may have continued their long vigil over the one true god of the sun. Early Christian writers mention a cult of the sun god that persists in Egypt, though whether that's an accurate description of Aten worship is debatable. But there's no doubt that a monotheistic Egypt would shape the Greeks' religious worldview, just as it did in our own timeline. It's likely that sun worship would blend into their own religions, though, or become a competitor for followers. They might dismiss the Egyptians as heretics, or they might embrace monotheism themselves. The concept of one god would spread across the Middle East, as Egyptian culture spread outward. It's possible that Atenism would become the foundation of Judaism, or even Christianity. Imagine Jesus teaching his disciples under the banner of the one sun god. Or picture Moses receiving the 10 Commandments from God atop Mount Sinai, which happens to be near where Akhenaten built his failed capital. But Egypt's cultural landscape would also be dramatically and their daughter Smenkhare reverted to polytheism after she took the throne as Akhenaten's successors abandoned his radical reforms, restoring the old gods and reappointing the old priests. We know that Akhenaten's religion developed some distinctly moral characteristics. There were good and bad people, and only the good would pass on to the afterlife. This suggests that Atenism could develop a strict system of judgment, reward, and punishment. In other words, an early form of hell and heaven. Maybe the faithful would be rewarded with eternal life under the sun, or perhaps they'd even get to spend time with the sun god himself. On the other hand, maybe the wicked would suffer eternal damnation, far from the life-giving rays of the sun. Either way, Atenism would offer a radically different concept of the afterlife than what would develop in later Abrahamic faiths. Still, when Akhenaten came to power, he had a lot of work to do. Most Egyptians still worshipped hundreds of gods and goddesses. To crush the old religion, Akhenaten went straight to the source of Egypt's power. Over centuries, Egypt would look very different. There wouldn't be a single polytheistic resurgence, at least not one that stuck. Just as Akhenaten had tried to rebuild Egypt's cities in the image of Aten, his successors would continue that tradition. They would build new communities and towns that were designed to worship the sun god. These towns would have their own temples, schools, and community spaces centered around the sun. Over time, that would create a society of monotheistics, each devoted to the worship of Aten. The old gods weren't going to take kindly to being demoted, especially since many of them lived in temples that dotted the landscape. Each temple had its own priest class that enjoyed vast wealth and influence, and those priests weren't about to let some upstart king take that away without a fight. His goal was to erase Egypt's old gods and make Aten, the sun disk, the one true god. It was a totalitarian campaign to turn everyone in Egypt to monotheism overnight, but it didn't work. Akhenaten built a new capital city focused around the sun and banned centuries of old traditions. But after he died, his successor restored the old gods and erased almost every trace of Akhenaten's religion. But what if his sun god revolution didn't die with him? What if he'd succeeded in turning Egypt into the first great monotheistic empire? Akhenaten's radical plan to remake Egyptian religion didn't come out of nowhere. So Akhenaten went on the offensive, seizing control of temples and expelling priests. Then he set about remaking Egypt in Aten's image. Many of the country's biggest cities were destroyed and rebuilt to face the rising sun. Temples were torn down and replaced with open sanctuaries dedicated to Aten, and Akhenaten made himself the high priest of Aten, taking the title He Who Knows the Secrets of the Aten. All this was part of a top-down campaign to impose Atenism on the Egyptian people. The goal was to change everything about how they practiced religion. Still, he never fully succeeded. While the Egyptian elite were forced to convert, the common people mostly kept their old beliefs secret. But what if Akhenaten's Aten had taken deeper roots among the populace? Art and architecture would remain new communities and traditions would spring up around Aten's worship. And over generations, Egypt would become fully monotheistic. But how would their version of Atenism compare to the one we know? Well, that's tough to say. But what about outside Egypt? How would the rest of the ancient world react to the rise of monotheism? The Egyptians' neighbors would definitely notice. With that said, there's no guarantee that Egyptian Atenism would survive the rise of new faiths. Either way, Egypt's identity would be shaped for centuries to come as the land of the one sun god. In our own timeline, traces of Egyptian Atenism can still be found today. In fact, ancient Egypt stands as one of the earliest examples of monotheism, offering a glimpse at a potential path not taken. Thanks for watching.